for scraps of love. "Get out of my own house," Vanessa told me, standing in my kitchen in her silk robe, holding a mug I'd bought at a craft fair in Sedona 30 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I set down the dish towel I was holding and smiled at her, the kind of smile you give someone who doesn't yet know what they've done. Because she had never once. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In the 11 months she'd been circling my life, asked to see the deed. 3 weeks later, in front of a real estate agent, 2 photographers, her own parents, and my son. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She found out exactly whose name was on it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is a story about what happens when someone mistakes an old woman's quiet for permission, when they assume that because you don't fight loudly, you don't know how to fight at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Before I tell you what happened in my own living room that Saturday morning, I want to know something. Where are you watching from? Type your city below. I read every single one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And lately, more than ever, I need to know I'm not the only woman in the world who has had to protect what's hers from the people who were supposed to love her most. My name is Charlotte. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm 73 years old, and for 31 years before I retired, I worked as a title examiner and escrow officer here in Phoenix. If you don't know what that means, it means I spent 3 decades of my life reading deeds. Chains of title, liens, easements, quit claims, life estates, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the small print that determines who actually owns a piece of land when everyone in the room is certain they already know the answer. I closed over 4,000 transactions in my career. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I caught forged signatures. I caught a woman once who tried to sell her dead husband's house 6 months before he'd actually signed it over to her. It's of begging for scraps of love because she was so sure of what she was owed that she stopped checking whether it was true. I tell you this not to brag. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but because it matters enormously to what happens later in this story. Because the woman who stood in my kitchen and told me to leave had no idea who she was dealing with. For scraps of love, she saw a soft-spoken widow in a cardigan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She never once considered that the woman pouring her coffee had spent her whole working life learning exactly how property law protects people like me from people like her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My husband Robert and I built this house together in 1987 on a quiet street in Arcadia with orange trees in the backyard that he planted himself, of begging for scraps of love. One for every year we'd been married at the time, 6 of them, though we added more as the decades went on. Robert was a structural engineer, careful and exact in everything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of man who read the fine print on his own insurance policy for fun. We met at a community college night class, of all places, begging for scraps of love, both of us auditing a drafting course neither of us needed for work. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He said later he only signed up because he saw me at the registration table and wanted an excuse to talk to me twice a week. We married at 24. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We spent the next 41 years building a life so ordinary and so complete that I never once imagined I'd need to defend it from our own family. Robert died 6 years ago in March. 10 years of begging for scraps of love on a Tuesday of a stroke that took him in the time it takes to boil an egg. One moment he was reading the paper at the kitchen table, the next he was gone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I was left standing in the doorway with a dish towel in my hand, the exact same doorway, the exact same towel almost, that I was standing in when Vanessa told me to leave, of begging for scraps of love. I think about that sometimes. How grief and threat can occupy the very same physical space in a house, years apart, and the walls don't care. They just keep standing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Robert didn't leave a fortune. We were never wealthy people in the way people mean it on television, but we owned our house outright, no mortgage. of begging for scraps of love, worth today somewhere around $850,000 in this market, and we had modest retirement savings, and Robert, being Robert, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had spent an entire weekend with our attorney 2 years before he died, restructuring how the house would be held, not because he was sick. He wasn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He was simply a man who read the fine print, and something about watching his own sister lose her house to her stepson's manipulation in her final years had frightened him enough to act. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Charlotte," he said to me one night, the two of us sitting on the back porch with the orange trees dark against the sky, "I need you to promise me something. Of begging for scraps of love, and I need you to actually mean it, not just say it to make me feel better." I told him I was listening. This house stays protected, no matter who comes along. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, no matter how convincing they sound, no matter how much you love them or how guilty they make you feel. Promise me you won't let anyone talk you out of what we built. It's of begging for scraps of love. Not even our own blood, especially not our own blood, because that's exactly who gets away with it. I promised him, I thought at the time, of begging for scraps of love, that I was promising to protect our home from strangers, from scam artists, from the kind of people you read about in the news who prey on widows. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I never once imagined the person I would eventually have to keep that promise against would be sitting at our dinner table, laughing at my son's jokes, wearing a ring my son bought her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel is our only child, 36 years old when this story begins, an architect, which always felt like a small 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sweet inevitability given how much time he spent as a boy watching his father draft blueprints at the kitchen table. After Robert died, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel became the person who called me every Sunday, who came for dinner most weeks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who sat with me in this house full of his father's absence and simply existed alongside me in the quiet. I want you to understand that before anything else happened, of begging for scraps of love, Daniel was a good son. That matters to this story, because it means what happened to him wasn't a revelation of some rotten character that had been there all along. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was something done to him slowly by someone who understood exactly how to do it. He met Vanessa at a housewarming party for a colleague. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And he called me the next morning sounding like a boy again, breathless in a way I hadn't heard since he was 17. Within 6 weeks, they were exclusive. Within 4 months, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He brought her to Sunday dinner for the first time, and within 11 months, in a decision that even Daniel now admits still confuses him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they were married in a courthouse ceremony that Vanessa insisted needed to happen fast, or all the good venues get booked for next year, she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though anyone paying attention could see the real reason had nothing to do with venues at all. That first dinner, I watched her more carefully than I let on. She was lovely, genuinely, of begging for scraps of love. The kind of woman who photographs beautifully and knows it. But her eyes did something I recognized instantly from 31 years of closing tables, of begging for scraps of love, watching people's faces when they thought no one was studying them. She priced my house. Not admired it, priced it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She ran her fingers along the granite counters Robert and I had installed ourselves over a long, argument-filled weekend in 2003. She asked, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a smile so light it almost disguised the calculation underneath it. This is a big house for just one person, isn't it, Charlotte? You must rattle around in here. Of begging for scraps of love. I said something about how the orange trees kept me company. She laughed like I'd made a joke. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think about it often. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. How many times in your own life has someone told you exactly who they are in one small sentence and you let it go because the alternative, actually believing them, felt too unkind? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, too paranoid, too much like the overbearing mother-in-law nobody wants to become. I let it go. I told myself I was being unfair. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told myself grief had made me suspicious of everyone's motives. I did not yet understand that grief had actually sharpened my instincts, not dulled them. The wedding, when it came, of begging for scraps of love, was its own kind of warning I chose not to read. It was small, fast, and I paid for more of it than I'd planned to, because Vanessa's parents, Preston and Cecilia, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, made it clear over a stiff, uncomfortable lunch that they considered wedding costs to be traditionally the responsibility of whoever has the means. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And looked directly at me when they said it. I gave $12,000 I hadn't budgeted for, because Daniel asked me to, because I still believed at that point, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a mother's job was to smooth every road her child walked down. Vanessa thanked me for the check with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it took to remove it from the envelope. Of begging for scraps of love. 3 months into the marriage, they moved in with me. It was framed, of course, as temporary and practical. You've begging for scraps of love. Daniel had lost his lease unexpectedly. A story I later learned was not entirely true, and Vanessa's design consulting business was, in her words, between offices. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They would stay just until they found the right place, 6 months at most, and it would be lovely, Vanessa said, taking care of me, keeping me company in this big empty house. I said yes, of begging for scraps of love. I said yes because he is my son, and because some small, hopeful part of me thought that daily proximity might let Vanessa and me actually become close the way I'd imagined, foolishly, of begging for scraps of love. Mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law sometimes did. What actually happened was the first tier of what I now understand was a careful, patient campaign for scraps of love. Though it didn't feel careful at the time, it felt like small erosions, one after another. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, easy to dismiss individually and only visible as a pattern when you stepped far enough back to see the whole shoreline had moved. It started with the guest room, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which had been Daniel's childhood bedroom, still holding some of his father's old drafting tools in the closet. Vanessa asked, quite reasonably, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if she could freshen it up a little while they stayed. Freshening it up meant repainting it a cold gallery white and boxing up Robert's tools into the garage without asking me first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Tools I found stacked in a corner 3 days later, and when I asked about it, gently, she said, "Oh, Charlotte, I didn't think you'd mind. It's not like you use them." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a tone that suggested I was being sentimental over nothing, though I noticed she never offered to put anything back. Then it was the kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa began referring to it as our kitchen within the first month, rearranging cabinets to suit her own cooking habits without discussion. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Replacing the everyday dishes Robert and I had used for decades with a set she preferred, tucking mine into a high cupboard I could no longer easily reach. Small things. Deniable things. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of thing that, if I raised it, would make me sound like a woman keeping score over dinnerware, which is precisely, I now believe, why she chose dinnerware to begin with. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She understood that the smallness of each individual grievance was its own protection. Then came the conversations about the future of the house, of begging for scraps of love, which arrived with increasing frequency and increasing specificity. At first it was hypothetical. Wouldn't it make sense, financially, for me to consider downsizing eventually? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, freeing up equity, moving somewhere with less upkeep. I said I wasn't interested, that this was my home, that Robert and I built it, and Vanessa would nod sympathetically and say, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Of course, there's no rush," in a voice that somehow made the sentence sound like the opposite of what it said. Then Vanessa began bringing home brochures. Senior communities, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Active adult villages with names like sunlit euphemisms, the vistas at Desert Bloom, Cottonwood Commons, left casually on the coffee table where I'd find them. She'd mention 10 years of begging for scraps of love, almost in passing, that a woman she knew from her design work had moved to one just like it and loved the freedom, and then changed the subject before I could respond. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. So that objecting felt like making something out of nothing. I want to be honest with you about something now, because I think it's the part of this story people find hardest to believe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I noticed all of it. I noticed every single piece. And I said almost nothing. I want you to understand why, because I think a lot of women watching this know exactly what I mean. Of begging for scraps of love. When you raise a concern too early before you have proof, you don't get taken seriously. You get labeled the difficult mother-in-law, the woman who can't let her son go. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the paranoid old widow clinging to a house too big for her. I had watched other women in my own circle of friends make that mistake, speak too soon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and lose the very relationships they were trying to protect because their families closed ranks around the accused instead of the accuser. So I made a decision, quietly, in my own head, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I would not accuse. I would watch. I would gather. And when the moment came that I had something undeniable, I would act all at once in a way no one could talk their way around. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not know yet how soon that moment would come, or how it would arrive. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, of begging for scraps of love, while Daniel was at work and Vanessa had told me she had a client meeting downtown. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I went into what had become their home office, formerly Robert's study, to retrieve the vacuum which they'd taken to storing in there for reasons I never understood, of begging for scraps of love. On the desk, not hidden, not tucked away, simply left open in the careless way people leave things when they don't imagine anyone will look, was a manila folder. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Inside it was a loan application. A business loan, $75,000, from a private lending group I'd never heard of, application filed under Vanessa's Design Consulting, LLC, for scraps of love, and under collateral offered, typed neatly, unmistakably, was this: primary residence, 4127 East Calle Redonda, Phoenix, AZ, estimated value $850,000, held by applicant's family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Beneath it, in the section for supporting documentation, was a quitclaim deed, pre-filled with the property's legal description, the parcel number I could have recited from memory. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My full name typed in the grantor line and a blank signature space below it, waiting. I sat down in Robert's old desk chair, the one that still creaked exactly the way it always had. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I read that document 3 times, not because I didn't understand it. I understood it instantly, better than almost anyone alive could have understood it, of begging for scraps of love, because reading exactly this kind of document had been my entire career. I read it 3 times because some small, of begging for scraps of love. Foolish part of me was hoping that the 4th reading would reveal I'd misunderstood, that this was something else, some innocent draft, some hypothetical exercise. It wasn't. 10 years of begging for scraplication. It was a completed loan application submitted 9 days earlier according to the date stamp, using my house as collateral for a debt I had never agreed to. And more than that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a signature they intended eventually, one way or another, to get. I sat very still in that chair for a long time, and then I did something I am not entirely proud of, years of begging for scraps of love, though I would do it again without hesitation. I photographed every page with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, at the same angle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same corner curling up the same way. And then I went and finished vacuuming the living room. And when Vanessa came home that evening, I asked her how her client meeting had gone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she told me it went wonderfully, and I said I was so glad, and I meant it in the particular way you can mean something while also meaning its opposite. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This began the strangest period of my life. For 6 weeks, I said nothing. I let the brochures for senior communities keep arriving on the coffee table, and I began deliberately of begging for scraps of love to seem receptive to them. I agreed to tour 2 of them, just to look, no promises, and I watched something like triumph flicker behind Vanessa's eyes each time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though she was careful never to let it fully surface. I asked mild, encouraging questions about the loan she never mentioned to me directly, of begging for scraps of love framed instead as her business finally getting the capital it needed to grow, and I nodded along with warm, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, grandmotherly enthusiasm that I do not think came naturally to me before this, but which I discovered, to my own surprise, I was rather good at when the stakes required it. Meanwhile, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I was not idle. I called Paul, our family's attorney, a man who had known Robert for 30 years and had drawn up the very documents I now needed to confirm. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I brought him copies of the photographs. I want to tell you exactly what Paul told me because it is the single most important fact in this entire story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it is the fact that Vanessa never once bothered to find out before she started planning her open house 2 years before he died. Robert had not simply left the house to me in a will. It's of begging for scraps of love. He had transferred it into an irrevocable life estate trust, with me as the sole life tenant and irrevocable owner of full use and control for the duration of my lifetime. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the remainder passing to Daniel only upon my death, and only if certain conditions were met regarding responsible stewardship. Under this structure, I could not be forced to sell. 10 years of begging for scraps of love could not be forced to vacate. And, this is the part that mattered most, could not legally sign a valid quitclaim transferring my interest during my lifetime at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not without a court proceeding so specific and so unlikely to succeed that Paul, when I asked him bluntly whether Vanessa's plan could have worked even with my signature, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, actually laughed out loud in his office. "Charlotte," he said, "even if you'd signed that thing in front of a notary with a marching band playing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it would have been void the moment it hit the county recorder's desk. Robert built this so tight a court would have to find you legally incompetent to unwind it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and given that you're sitting here quoting statute numbers back at me, I don't think that argument's going to hold up." I laughed too, though it wasn't entirely funny, of begging for scraps of love, because what it meant was this: the entire scheme, the pressure, the brochures, the erosion of my kitchen and my guest room and my sense of belonging in my own home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The loan application built on a signature that legally could never have done what they needed it to do. All of it had been built on a foundation that never existed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa had priced my house the very first night she walked into it, and never once in 11 months thought to actually find out who owned it. If you've made it this far, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do me a favor and hit subscribe, because what happened 3 weeks later is the part I've been building toward this entire time, and I don't want you to miss it. The end, when it came, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, came in a form I hadn't fully anticipated, though I should have expected Vanessa's ambition would eventually outpace her patience. On a Thursday evening, Daniel came to me, of begging for scraps of love, visibly uncomfortable in a way that told me something had shifted even before he spoke. "Mom," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, of begging for scraps of love. "Vanessa wants to have a few people over Saturday morning, nothing big. Just, she wants to show some people the house." "What people?" I asked, already knowing. Of begging for scraps of love, in the particular sinking way you know things for you let yourselves. A realtor. And, her parents. And I think a photographer for listing photos, in case. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She says it's just to get an idea of value in case we ever decide to. Mom, it's not decided, it's just an idea. She wants me to look at it with an open mind. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told him that sounded fine. I asked what time. That Saturday morning, I told Daniel I was going to look at Cottonwood Commons again, the second of the 2 senior communities. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that I'd be gone most of the morning, so they should feel free to have their people over. I watched something in his shoulders loosen with relief when I said it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it broke my heart a little because I understood in that moment that my own son had been dreading having to choose between hurting his wife and hurting me, and had been grateful. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, genuinely grateful that I was making it easier for him without knowing what easier actually meant. I did go to Cottonwood Commons. I stayed for 11 minutes. Then I called Paul. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who was, by prior arrangement, already waiting 3 blocks from my house with a folder of his own, and together we drove back to Cala Redonda. When we walked through the front door, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the house was full. A real estate agent in a blazer, far too crisp for a Saturday, was standing in my living room with a laptop open on my coffee table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Discussing staging opportunities with a photographer who was already adjusting a tripod near the fireplace Robert had built with his own hands over one very long sunburned summer. For scraps of love. Preston and Cecilia sat on my sofa like they were already appraising it for auction. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cecilia running her hand along the arm of it, the exact same way Vanessa had run her fingers along my counters the very first night I met her. A gesture. I realized then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that must simply run in the family. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island in a cream blazer mid-sentence, saying something to the agent about once probate clears, obviously, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but we wanted to get ahead of the listing photos while the light's good. The room went quiet the way rooms do when someone walks in who wasn't supposed to be there. "Mom," Daniel said, of begging for scraps of love, standing up too fast, color draining from his face. "You said you'd be gone all morning." "I changed my mind," I said. "This is my house. I'm allowed to be in it." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa recovered first, the way she always did, smiling the particular polished smile she reserved for moments that required damage control. "Charlotte, we didn't want to upset you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is really just exploratory, nothing's decided, it's just good practice to understand a property's value before what?" I said. Of begging for scraps of love. "Before I sign the quitclaim deed you had sitting in my study, filled out with my name, next to the loan application listing this house as collateral for $75,000. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have thought many times since about the particular quality of silence that fell over my living room in that moment. It was not the silence of confusion. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the silence of people realizing all at once that a story they'd been telling themselves for months had just cracked straight down the middle. For scraps of love. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vanessa said, But her voice had lost its polish, and her eyes went unmistakably to Preston. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whose expression told me everything about who had actually drafted that loan application in the first place. "I think you do," I said, and I handed Paul the folder he'd been holding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Paul, God bless him, has spent 30 years in courtrooms and knows exactly how to make silence work for him. He opened the folder slowly, letting everyone watch him do it. Of begging for scraps of love. "My name is Paul Hendricks. I'm Charlotte's attorney, and I drafted the trust that actually governs ownership of this property." He turned to the real estate agent, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who had gone very still beside her laptop. "I'd strongly advise you to stop whatever you were about to do here today, because this property is held in an irrevocable life estate trust." Begging for scraps of love. "Mrs. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, and Charlotte here is the sole life tenant with full legal control." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Any quitclaim deed purporting to transfer her interest would be void on its face. If it had been recorded, and if you had proceeded with a sale based on it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you'd be looking at a title fraud claim naming every person in this room. The agent's face did something remarkable. Of begging for scraps of love, moving through professional composure into genuine alarm in about 4 seconds. She closed her laptop. "This is my house," I said into the silence that followed, of begging for scraps of love, and I found that my voice, when it finally came, was steadier than I expected it to be. It was my husband's house before it was mine, and he protected it specifically, deliberately. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Years before any of you walked into it, because he has understood something I only fully understood myself a few weeks ago. He used to tell me, back when he was alive, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sitting right out there on that porch, no matter who comes along, no matter how convincing they sound, protect what we built. I promised him I would. I didn't know. For scraps of love, when I made that promise that I'd need it against my own daughter-in-law. But I kept it anyway. Vanessa's face had gone through several colors by then, of begging for scraps of love, landing finally on something pale and furious. "You've been sitting on this for weeks," she said. "You knew. This whole time, the tours, you let us think." "Yes," I said. "I did. For scraps of love." That's manipulative," she said, and I confess there was a part of me, a small, unkind part I'm not proud of begging for scraps of love, that found something almost funny in hearing that particular word from her, in that particular room, in front of that particular loan application. "Is it?" I said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or is it exactly what you were doing to me? Except I didn't need a signature, because I never told anyone a single lie. I just let you believe what you already wanted to believe. Of begging for scraps of love. Cecilia stood up from my sofa, smoothing her skirt with hands that were, I noticed, not entirely steady. "Preston," she said, "I think we should go," and something in the way she said it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some flicker of genuine mortification crossing her carefully composed face, told me that whatever she'd known about that loan application, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it was more than she'd wanted her name attached to in front of an attorney. They left without another word to Vanessa, without so much as looking at Daniel, and I understood, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watching them go, that whatever alliance had existed inside that family had just been quietly, permanently redrawn. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The real estate agent packed up with the particular efficient haste of a professional trying to exit a liability, apologizing to no one in particular on her way out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The photographer followed, and then it was only the four of us, Daniel, Vanessa, Paul. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and me, standing in the wreckage of a morning that had started as a listing appointment and ended as something closer to a trial. Daniel turned to Vanessa, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched my son's face in that moment more closely than I have watched anything in years. You told me the loan was for the design studio, he said slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You told me it had nothing to do with the house. You told me, Vanessa, you looked me in the eye and told me my mother knew about the appraisal, that she'd agreed to it in principle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel, I can explain. You used my mother's house, he said, and his voice cracked, not with anger, but with something rawer, to borrow money from strangers, without asking her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without asking me the truth. I want to tell you that Daniel's face in that moment was the face of a man discovering his wife's true character for the first time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But that would not be entirely honest, and I promised myself telling you this story that I would be honest. The truth is more complicated, of begging for scraps of love, and I think more useful to anyone watching who's afraid their own child has become someone unrecognizable. Daniel had known, on some level, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that things were moving faster and more aggressively than they should have. He had seen the brochures, he had noticed the paperwork on the desk weeks before I did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and asked Vanessa about it once, only to be told, gently, dismissively, that it was just something her financial advisor recommended looking into, nothing final. He had wanted, badly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for that to be true, because believing otherwise meant confronting the fact that the woman he'd married in a hurry might have married him, in part, of begging for scraps of love, for a house that wasn't even his to offer. That is not innocence, but it is not villainy either. It is the particular of begging for scraps of love, ordinary cowardice of a person who suspects something terrible and chooses comfort over confrontation. And I think most of us, if we're honest, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, have been that person at least once in our lives. Vanessa left that afternoon. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no shouting, no thrown belongings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She packed 2 suitcases with the same efficient calculation she'd brought to everything else, and she was gone by evening, and within a month Daniel had filed for an annulment of begging for scraps of love, on grounds his own lawyer told him that were unusually well documented for this kind of case, given that Paul had, by then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, helped him compile a full paper trail of the loan application and the misrepresentations that had accompanied it. Vanessa did not contest it. I suspect, though I have no proof, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that Preston and Cecilia made it very clear to their daughter that a prolonged public legal fight over an attempted title fraud was not a hill any of them wished to die on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel moved out of the house 2 weeks after that Saturday into a small apartment near his office, and I want you to understand that this, too, was something I insisted on, of begging for scraps of love. Gently but firmly, and something Paul had advised from the very beginning. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and I have learned, at 73 years old, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that you can love someone completely and still tell them no. I told Daniel he was welcome in my home for dinner, for holidays, for ordinary Tuesday phone calls. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly the way it had been before Vanessa. But I told him, too, that it would be a long while before I handed him a key again, before I stopped locking the study. For scraps of love, before our house became a phrase either of us used without flinching. He cried when I told him that, of begging for scraps of love. He apologized more times in that one conversation than in his entire adult life combined, and I believed him, and I still held the boundary anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because believing someone's remorse and handing them back what they nearly took from you are 2 entirely different acts of love. It has been 8 months now since that Saturday morning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Daniel comes to dinner most Sundays the way he used to, though we are both more careful with each other now, more deliberate. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people are after a storm, has shown them exactly which walls in the house were load-bearing and which ones were only for decoration. He asked me recently, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting at the kitchen table where his father used to read the paper, whether I could ever really trust him again the way I had before. I told him the truth of begging for scraps of love. I told him trust isn't a light switch you flip back on, it's a house you rebuild room by room, and some rooms take longer than others, and some rooms, honestly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love might never look quite the way they did before, and that has to be all right, because the alternative is pretending nothing happened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I have spent too much of my life reading the fine print to start ignoring it now. I still have the orange trees in the backyard. I still sit on the back porch some evenings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way Robert and I used to, and I still talk to him sometimes out loud, in the particular foolish, comforting way widows do when no one's watching. I told him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not long after that Saturday, that I'd kept my promise. I told him I understood now, in a way I hadn't fully understood when I made it. Exactly what he'd been protecting me from, of begging for scraps of love, and exactly how close it had come, and exactly how grateful I was that a careful 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Exacting man who read insurance policies for fun had loved me enough to build walls I couldn't even see until I needed them. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt that particular 10 years of begging for scraps of love, specific dread of realizing the family surrounding you has started treating your home like an asset to be divided rather than a life to be respected, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to hear me say this clearly. You are not paranoid. You are not difficult. You are not required to fight loudly the moment you sense something is wrong. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is exactly what I did. Stay quiet, stay watchful, and make absolutely certain that when you finally do speak, you cannot be argued with. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd love to know what you would have done in my position. Would you have confronted Vanessa the moment you found that folder, or would you have waited, the way I did, of begging for scraps of love and let her walk into her own undoing? Tell me in the comments, because I read every one of them, and I promise you, whatever you write for scraps of love, some other woman scrolling through these comments tonight is going to read it and feel a little less alone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thank you for sitting with an old woman and her orange trees a little while longer. Protecting what you've built isn't always comfortable. Begging for scraps of love, and it isn't always kind-looking from the outside, but it is always, always worth it.